Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending our presentation, Checking the Boxes, Racism, Latinx, and the Census. My name is Jesse Silva. I'm the Scholarly Resources Strategy and U.S. Government Information Librarian in the UC Berkeley Library, and I'll be serving as moderator for this event. I have just a few words before we begin. We'd like to recognize and thank our sponsors for this session, the UC Berkeley Library, the American Culture Center, and the Institute of Governmental Studies. We also have a couple additional thank yous to share. Thank you to Amber Lawrence for running much of the behind-the-scenes technology, Susan Edwards and Ann Glusker for helping to plan the session and for monitoring the questions, and a huge thank you to our speakers, who I'll be introducing in just a couple minutes. This session is also being recorded and will be available on the library's YouTube channel. And now on with the session. Census 2020, like every census since 1790, uses racial categorizations that reflect the prejudices of the time. At the same time, it provides a powerful tool that exposes the impact of racism on income, education, health, home ownership, employment, and more for each and every person living in the United States. Census questions have even caused a number of legal challenges in the recent past. In today's session, we'll hear from three renowned Berkeley faculty on how these contested categories impact their research and teaching. Each panelist will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll move into a question-answer dialogue with them. If you have a question for the panelists during the session, please submit it by clicking on the Q&A button. We will do our best to get to all your questions. Our first presenter is Cristina Mora, Associate Professor of Sociology and Chicano Latino Studies. Her research interests include racial and ethnic categorization, organizations, and immigration. Cristina is also the author of Making Hispanics: How Activists, Bureaucrats, and the Media Constructed a New American. Tina Sachs is our second presenter. She is an assistant professor in the School of Social Welfare. Her research interests include racial inequalities in health, social determinants of health, and poverty and inequality. Tina is also the author of the book Invisible Visits: Black Middle-Class Women in the American Healthcare System. And our final presenter is Victoria Robinson. Victoria is a lecturer and the American Cultures Program Director in the Department of Ethnic Studies. She teaches courses addressing race and ethnicity in the United States and global female migrations. As director of the American Culture Center, Victoria has continued the work to build Berkeley's nationally recognized undergraduate diversity curriculum into the amazing program that it is today. And I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Cristina Mora.
Thank you very much, Jesse, and thank you to the staff for putting on such a great event. It's certainly an honor to be among such distinguished faculty speaking about this really important issue. And so what I'll do today is touch on a few broad points based on my and others' research on the census, which I hope allows us to set off a broader conversation about current events and current happenings with the census today. And specifically, I want to make 5 points in the time we have here today. And to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen to help the conversation stay on track. Okay, so top 5 things I think that right now we need to know about race and the census. So the first thing is ethnic and race categories are political construct. These are often political classifications. They are not set in stone scientific markers of identity or genetic composition. How do we know this? Well, one important way we know this is because if you look at census racial classifications, they've changed considerably since 1790. The work of Melissa Nobles and others show that historically over time, who we think groups are, where they fall, and how they should be classified racially has changed. For example, at the turn of the 20th century, the census had categories like quadroon and octoroon, put there in part because political legislators were concerned with miscegenation, drawing on sort of racist scientific ideas within eugenics, and put those categories on the census. Today, we don't have those categories. Over time, we've seen, for example, Mexicans and Puerto Ricans be classified as white, or be classified, for example, in the Mexican case, as their own category. We've also seen, for example, South Asian classified as their own Hindu category, as it was once called, or classified as simply white, and now we see them classified as Asian. Over time, these categories have been incredibly unstable, but in many ways, the populations are still the same. And so we need to think about these racial categories as reflections of the political times, not as sort of set in stone scientific understandings. Given that, some have argued that because racial categories are so messy and politically constructed, why don't we just get rid of them? But the answer is not so easy, and it leads me to point number 2. Still, census data serves as a really valuable and important resource for social justice. And I'll give you one example that comes from my own research on the making of the Hispanic or Latino category in the census. In the 1960s, Mexican-American and Puerto Rican activists inspired by the Black Civil Rights Movement began to organize and make claims on the state, on the governors, on city mayors, and even on the office of the presidency to do things about the increasing unemployment, poverty, and racial discrimination that seemed to run rampant within these communities. Yet every time they went to, for example, the governor's office or even to the presidency to demand, for example, job training programs in Latino neighborhoods, these organizations or these folks would just say, well, where's your data? Show us that this is happening. Well, that was really difficult for Mexican-American organizations in large part because the Census Bureau used to classify them as white. So when the census would collect data on income used to provide a portrait on poverty in America, it would mix Mexican data with data from the descendants of Irish, Italians, and others. And the poverty reports would focus on sort of Black and white differences and be of no use really for a fight for racial justice in Latino communities. It wasn't until these groups consistently mounted a campaign to lobby the census to create a separate category that would separate Latino data from white that they could then show these are the statistics on Latino poverty, these are the statistics on Latino underrepresentation, Latino education, etc. So in many ways, when these categories become formed, they can then serve as a real way to hold state institutions accountable. Okay, my third point is that aside from being a tool for racial justice, in general for everybody, census enumeration is connected to rights and opportunities. You know, the Constitution has a mandate for a census to cover all persons, and connected to those counts are 2 types of resources. One is political representation, which means the number of persons counted, all persons counted in an area, is then connected to the amount of political representation you'll have. So the number of congressmen, the number of state legislators, etc. And also that count now is connected to the amount of federal monies and state monies that your community would get. So the more people, the more money, the more representation. All this means that an undercount is really, really bad. And a systematic undercount among certain populations is even worse. But we live in a moment of, well, we've long lived in a moment of intense inequalities. And what we see is that there are communities called HTCs, or hard to count communities. And those are consistently immigrant, the children, the poor, and racial minorities. We are systematically, often every single decade, undercounting these populations, which means then that those populations are receiving less political representation and less funds to meet their needs, okay? 4 is because of these HTCs and because it's so important to have as much enumeration as possible or a full count across all communities, the Census Bureau has now for decades, at least since the 1960s, relied on community groups and community activists. So people of color community activist groups to help them get out the vote in these hard to count communities. And so you should know that groups like the National Association of Latino Elected Officials, the NAACP, the Urban League, all varieties of these racial minority advocacy groups have longed to use their own money, their own time, their own resource, their own energy to help the Bureau do its job, in part because these counts are so important. Another reason that they need to rely on these community activists is because we live in a time of extreme distrust and extreme political cynicism. It's really hard to get Americans right now to say that they trust the government, even if it's from the Office of the Presidency to now the CDC to now even the Census Bureau. And so having these organizations help communities of color, especially, trust the census and trust that when they open the door for a census enumerator or when they fill out a census form, that their information won't be used in nefarious ways. Now, historically, this has been really hard, especially within the Latino population, in part because at different moments in time, these census counts have correlated in certain ways with widespread deportation campaigns, right? And in the past, the Census Bureau has admitted to sort of using POC data in nefarious ways, especially Asian data and its connection to Asian internment during World War II, Mexican data and its connection to the widespread deportation in the 1930s of these Mexicans and Mexican Americans. So this is an effort that relies on trust and an effort that now relies on a growing amount of community activism around this. Okay, the fifth and final point is that the census is at a center of political debate even today. So aside from these categories, the census endeavor as a whole is often caught in sort of political traps as soon as new administrations come into play. So we look at the Trump administration. As soon as they came in, they cut funding for the census, which then means there's less money to do marketing and outreach and remind people to get counted. There are things like the cutting off of funding for research. There's lots of important research done on what is the best way to measure racial categories right now. That takes money, and that funding has been cut. Right now, we're squarely in the middle of a fight of how long census enumerators can be in the field and when sort of the time span to collect a full count, how long that should take. And right now, we're in the middle of a battle with sort of advocacy groups taking to the courts demanding that time span, because of the pandemic, be extended, and the Trump administration insisting that it should be shortened now. All of that has implications, large and small, with not only a full count and enumeration, but as a corollary to the extent to which the census can actually be used to sort of address systemic racial inequalities in the United States. All right, so those are my 5 points. I'll turn it over to Tina now.
Thank you so much, Professor Mora, to Christina. And I am not going to be using slides today, but I just want to share a few stories with you from my own experience, really living at the kind of the intersection of what I call the mutability of these racial categories as they relate to the census, as well as the the mutability of the census categories, as well as the meaningfulness of these census categories. And so I want to share just a little bit of my own experience working as a census enumerator, and also as a person who really traverses these categories, these racial categories that are essentially both made up, but incredibly meaningful in the real world. And so in 2010, I was an enumerator, and I had the experience of going out to many people's homes and experiencing with them what it's like to actually to be counted, so to speak. I went into one woman's home, and she, when we came to the racial classification question, I told her that at least under the Office of Management and Budget guidelines of 2010, when I was an enumerator, that she could check off more than one box in terms of race. This was a woman who was about 60 years old at the time, and she explained to me that she had never been allowed to check more than one box. This was a woman who described herself as a mixed race Black woman, Black and white woman. And given the history of the United States that really adheres to the rule of hypodescent, which essentially means that if you have one drop of Black blood, you are considered Black, this woman had never felt the freedom essentially to count herself as she wanted to be counted in terms of her racial classification as both Black and white. That said, this was an incredibly meaningful experience for her. And as someone who also traverses this sort of middle ground, I also know that the categories that we use are, as Professor Mora has just mentioned, they are essentially meaningless in terms of race or biology. That there is no such thing as really biological differences between races. These differences have been socially and politically developed. They serve, I would argue, and many others would argue, a very particular political purpose. They essentially, in many ways, support a system of racial capitalism so that we can essentially sort and stratify people based on their race. And group people into two groups that are both politically and socially meaningful as well as economically meaningful. That said, I also, although these categories are not biologically meaningful, there is no way to argue that they are not socially meaningful. And so, for example, in my personal case, I also share the story of many years ago, also as Christina, Professor Mora just mentioned, that these categories have changed over time, and those changes really reflect political and social changes and cultural changes in our society. So many years ago, when my grandmother passed away, I found her immigration papers when she had passed through Ellis Island, and under race, she was listed there as Hebrew. And my grandmother was a Jewish woman from what is now Belarus, and she was listed there on her immigration papers as Hebrew, as though Hebrew was a race, sort of, and the way we think about race now in the present. And so I think these are very interesting questions that we are wrestling with here in the present. But we know that as much as these categories are made up, we know, particularly for the work that I do, which is around poverty and around social safety net programs, particularly around health and healthcare, we know that the census is an incredibly and in fact invaluable tool for keeping up with how many people we have in the United States, how do we apportion very important resources like food stamp benefits, Head Start slots, other early childhood education programs, free lunch programs in schools. All of these things have very material consequences for people who are living right now. And so I really try to think about, as I'm thinking and teaching about the census and its implications in the present, that it is so incredibly important to be counted. It is incredibly important to understand the racial classification, the racial distribution of our societies, so that we can have a quantitative assessment of how race and how social problems, I should say, are distributed by race, how they fall across societies and communities by race. So to say that we need to know how people are disproportionately affected by certain health conditions, by lead poisoning, by exposure to airborne particulates, et cetera. We need to know that, and we need to know that based on race so that we can have an understanding of how these inequities are affecting our society so that we may be able to do something about it. And just as a point of comparison, for example, in Europe, the French government does not collect information by race, and that is a very particular, also politically constructed reality. The French government has the perspective that everyone here is simply French and that nationality trumps race. And that while that is theoretically a very lofty proposition, we know that in reality in France and in the United States, obviously, that race matters, and race often is related to, or in some ways determines one's life outcomes, whether someone is going to have the ability to go to a good school, to get a subsidized lunch if they need one, to get health insurance if they need it. And so in France, they have decided to very recently actually to even strike the word race from their constitution. This is a decision that they think will increase racial cohesion in the country. But instead, I would argue, and I think others would as well, is what it essentially does is sort of washes away racial differences, much in the way that Professor Mora referenced earlier. It essentially does away with your ability to count, to figure out who has what, who is disproportionately affected, and therefore, of course, to perhaps to be able to engage and to advocate and to organize to do away with those social problems. And so just one other sort of my final point that I want to make before turning it over to Professor Robinson is just to also note that the intersection of being counted and race also has huge implications for place. So where you live matters. Getting counted in that particular locale matters. In particular, as we're talking about, and this dovetails with Professor Robinson's work, we know that at least, since the census in the United States began in 1790, that people who have been incarcerated have been counted in the locale in which they are incarcerated. And what that means in the United States in 2020 is that we know disproportionately Black people and people of color are disproportionately represented in the prison system and the carceral system. Those people tend to be imprisoned in areas, in rural white areas in the United States. And so what happens when people are counted in these white rural areas, it actually potentially can redistribute resources from locales in which we are removing many people from locations by incarcerating them, taking them out of their communities in which their community of origin. So we're already losing that person as a resource to the community. And then by counting them in the census area, the tract in which they currently reside, in which they are incarcerated, we're removing a resource, the human resource that people are taking them away from their families. And then we are also counting them in an area which sort of overcounts the number of people in a certain area, and generally in the United States, and sort of in a white rural area. And we are taking away that count from the often more urban and more Black or brown parts of the United States in which many people who are incarcerated previously resided. And so that's also another huge issue in terms of representation, in terms of resources, in terms of the equitable resources, distribution of resources in this country. And so I just want to end with that as an idea. Yes, racial classification is incredibly problematic. It has been mutable over time, through time, and it is absolutely a political construction. And that said, it has enormous real world, literally bread and butter consequences for communities. And so being counted is incredibly important, because this is how we apportion resources in this country. And I hope that this count this year, it does an adequate job of counting all of the people who are historically undercounted in the census. And with that, I will turn it over to Professor Victoria Robinson.
So I think what I'm going to provide is some summary and overlap between Christina and Tina, and it's lovely to be in this space with them both. And just a small story to enter this space, which is that 25 years ago, I was in love with a Jamaican guy that I'd met in Berkeley, and I was bringing him home to England for the first time. And my grandparents had lived in South Africa, and I'm introducing him to my grandparents for the first time. And my grandmother looks up from her chair and says to my husband, who identifies as Black, "You're not Black, you're a lovely color." And there was this collision of racial classifications that were in the room on that moment, which is what do my grandparents understand about their lived relationships to South Africa, the time that we found ourselves in England, my husband's relationship to the colonial threads of Jamaica, and our lives in California. And I think that speaks really strongly to the mutability of race and racial classifications, not just in the US, but globally. What Tina and Christina have set up so wonderfully for us is thinking about the contestation of pressures, forces forces from above and below that make the classifications that we use to sort and stratify what we think of as race in the United States. Tina ended us on a note that I actually want to end on also, which is the connections between race and geography. Race and space. Space is racialized and race is spatialized, and those are pernicious effects and also gathering effects in our life. We organize from where we live. And also the material consequences, the ongoing material consequences of the ways in which we're sorted and stratified and the way in which race affects our life. Okay, so there are a few slides here. Again, to summarize what we've been hearing so far, and I'm going to just move through some of these really quickly. The very significant effect of half of federal state dollars distributed to states come as a reasoning from the population count that comes from the census. So approximately this in 2010, $675 billion. I think that's incredibly important. And we started to talk about political apportionment. And the common thread between Christina and Tina, of course, is thinking about how do we know a society is just if we don't count how it judges us. And it's interesting maybe at this moment to think that there have been and there continue to be efforts to think about so-called colorblindness. The thesis being that if we remove the classification of race, then race doesn't govern the ways in which we are creating our relationships to each other. So we can talk about colorblindness maybe in the Q&A. And in 2003, Proposition 54, the so-called Racial Privacy Initiative, was put on the California state ballots. And of course, that's been contested. That was actually Proposition 54 in 2003 was backed by then UC Regent Ward Connolly, who'd also been the architect of the mid-1990s Proposition 209, which is now being replaced by Proposition 16. Proposition 209, of course, was the anti-affirmative action ballot. But the idea that we could remove the ways in which we think about race and see each other, so-called colorblindness, and then that was the solution by a lot of conservative critics to the ways in which race is so dominant in our lives. And as has been outlined also by both my colleagues, the citizenship question, the 2020 census is like every census. It's full of political contestation and consternation. But the ones that have really floated to the surface, of course, the first one is the citizenship question. And the idea that Wilbur Ross had, who was head of the Commerce Bureau, to say that it was about enforcement of voting rights, and that was actually judged to be not necessarily to be in the most truthful of terms by the current administration. And we're now having to think about what are the effects that it may have had, the dampening effect on the ways in which people are recording their relationship to the households that they live in. There are estimates right now running around from scholars on this campus and others that perhaps 6.5 million people may not have filled in the census as a result of how those bubbling ideas of being monitored and surveilled from the census have been attached to people's behaviors. And of course, as Christina said too, is that why would our communities assume that the Census Bureau does have the best of intents when coming out of the War Department in 1940, the census of 1940 was considered to be the most single important document and set of data to locate where those who were Japanese and Japanese American were for removal into the camps. So the Fred Korematsu Institute that was established in the 1990s to think about civil rights and human rights and the relationship to race in the US has been a powerful organization in advocating for the human rights and the representation of citizenship questions in the lawsuits currently, which have overturned the citizenship question. So we do not have a citizenship question on the 2020 census. And the idea of ending early, right? So the 2020 census is not going to have the citizenship question because it was ruled that it violated federal law. But the idea of finishing the census early, we're not sure where this stands. And I just want to point you to Hansi-Lo Wong, who just 2 hours ago stated that it seems as if October the 5th might be the deadline for being able to make your census count vote. But it also, hopefully, because of COVID and the need to administer and engage with to those who are not represented yet, it could be October the 31st. So it's still in doubt. I wanted to quickly show, again, to underline what so many of us have been talking about in the space, is this mutability, this stretching, this elasticity of the relationship of race categories to the census itself. I love this little website online. It's called racebox.org. It was actually constructed by a UC Berkeley student. 20 years ago, I was sitting in Dwinell lecture hall, running away with microfiche, dropping it all over the floor. This young student came up and said, I can do better than that, scanned it all, put it onto a website, and now racebox.org allows us to think about how those categories have really been collected through time. And I would actually urge people to have a look at that because it's a great way to see from 1790 to the current 2020 census, so across 24 censuses, what we're talking about when we think of our racial categorizations. And of course, the idea of the census is altered, right? Before 1960s, the census was used to discriminate against. It's the pernicious effects of racial classification and racial discrimination in our society. Some of the major aspects of how we live our lives and how we make choices to be with people, to have relationships to property, to think about the ways in which we can migrate across our national borders and within them. And then, of course, after the 1960s, it's used to monitor racial inequalities, which both Tina and Christina have been sharing with us. Okay, I'm going to try to get through a ton of this very, very quickly. One of the most important things, I think, is to ask between each census, why are we asking and why are we altering the racial classifications? You know, what is it about the 10 years before that we think we need to ask questions about, right? So mulatto in 1850, why is it that actually this is a multiracial category, right? And it's for 100 years that we don't come back to the idea of being able to designate oneself more in more than one space. But in 1850, we have a multiracial category called mulatto. So what's going on in society then? Why in 1860 are we thinking about property as slaves? What is it in relationship to where the nation is that the idea of these questions are fronted? And again, we need to think about that in relationship to why citizenship today. What is it about the relationship to citizen that is put forth such consternation for the 2020 census? So again, every category is relative to the ways in which we're thinking about the major questions in front of society. The 2000 census was phenomenal, right? The 2000 census actually altered many things for many people. And it had big questions. And again, let's think about where we are right now. We've come from 2010 to 2020. What are the big questions for us? In 2000, which was from 1990 to 2000, as Christina was saying, there is a lot of bubbling up of community activity, of grassroots movement, advocating for legibility, to be seen, to think about identification as one's political right. And at the same time, what is the consequence of that legibility? So there's a question in front of the Census Bureau in making the 2000 census. Should we have a multiracial category? What's the context for that question? Should there be a so-called Hispanic race, which is what Christina has been talking about also? Should we have the idea of a Middle Eastern, Arab American, North African category? And should we have an indigenous category? Now, I think it really is important to kind of slow down and think, what is it about the idea of these questions being asked just before the 2000 census, and which ones get taken up and why not, or why not? And again, is it the advocacy of grassroots, or is it the institutional pressure from on top that is saying what categories we are going to see, what questions we are going to ask? And I think I've almost run out of time. I think one of the most important things to remember is that, so the 2000 census really showed us actually how few people, even though we want to think about and affirm the relationship to race not being fixed, of it being a social construct, look at how many people actually affirm themselves as relative to one race. So this kind of fixity of the relationship of race in people's minds. Okay, I am going to run out of time pretty damn quickly. And I think I'm going to stop there. I was going to talk about the fact that, yes, I'm going to stop here and think about the Attica problem with everybody in questions and answers.
Thank you all for a great overview of the census. This is very quick, and we have very limited time to talk about a lot of these complicated issues, but we do have some questions to get through from the audience. First question is, would you support changing the current race and ethnic categories, and if so, how? I think this could be open to anyone who wants to answer.
Sure, I'll say a few things. So one of the big parts about the racial classification has always been about how Latino or Latinx populations are categorized in the U.S. We have this awkward other question, right, that comes outside of the racial classification question. And there are a couple of ways to think about that, right? On the one hand, Latinos are so varied. They've got many different skin tones, speak different languages, different class, social standings, that it's hard to figure out where they fit. At the same time, if there is no sort of separate category for them, there's then the assumption that the categories that we have right now, white, Black, Asian, Native American, can adequately fit these populations and their experience. And so we've seen from the way censuses have been filled out that folks that consistently check the some other race, the vast majority, upwards of 90% of them, tend to be Latinx or Latino populations. And within the Latino population, about 50% of them consistently choose white, and 50% consistently choose other, or do some combination of a lot of different boxes. And so for demographic analysis, this is a nightmare. You don't want a population for which is, you don't want a category some of the race, which is 90% comprised of a population. And so that's a big red flag. Under the Obama administration in about 2012, the census took a serious effort to investigate these things. They did something called the National Content Test, whose one of their big goals was to see what the racial categories would be like. And in 2017, they came out with their results. And within the Bureau, their sort of race and ethnicity team very clearly argued that the Latino category should be within the race question. So whether you wanted to now call the question race and ethnicity, race, color, and ethnicity, whatever you wanted to call it, that this other question, what it was basically doing was causing confusion, and it was actually leading to skipped questions, right? It was actually messing up data, not only for Latinos, but for everybody, right? Because people would then consistently skip that question if they think it didn't pertain to it. And you actually don't want that either, right? Because you can't assume that whoever skips it is because they're non-Latino, for example. And while there was a large report, while the findings were supported by various demographers and race scholars across the country, under the Trump administration, this recommendation was sidelined. This recommendation was not taken, taken up for the 2020 census with the argument that more research is needed. What was also sidelined, which came out of the 2015 content test analysis, was the MENA category. There was an argument that there should be a place for a MENA category, and that also was sidelined with the argument of more scholarship is needed. And so this feeds back to what Victoria was saying, that there's a lot of it, what part of this is politics, right? And what administration is in power and who is overseeing the census. I think it also tells us that the census is not this one block. I think more than anything, that shows us that within the census, there are people, demographers, race demographers, social scientists, who really understand these issues and sort of provide very detailed best recommendations based on the best science we have possible. And even when they do that, at the end of the day, Wilbur Ross or the head of the Department of Commerce, who's put there by the president, will have the final say.
Mm-hmm. I think it's also interesting to know that the census also cleans up data. So the census have about 1,100 ways in which people have designated themselves racially, and they keep it in their basement. And it's everything from, Michael Omi was saying that in the 2000 census, there was a lot of write-ins saying, I'm a Jedi. And that kind of why? Because we were going through a Star Wars revival, right? But then the Census Bureau cleans up that data and makes sense of it. So the relationship to what we're seeing is actually also a relationship between the Bureau making decisions for us about what we see. So that's really important too. But to underline Christina's point about the MENA category, is that the first time that that's proposed, of course, is in the middle of the Gulf Wars. And the idea of, one, that's the community that's been subject most to hate crimes, racially biased hate crimes, and we can't see those relationships because their classifications are hidden within other categories. But also the community then advocates not to be legible to the state. So part of the reason we don't have a MENA category for a long time is also because of the advocacy of the community themselves not to be seen in those terms. And then shift forward into 2020, and Iranian Americans have been asking to not be classified within the category white, and advocating through their own community organizing to say, do a write-in, put Iranian down when you have a write-in box. So as Christina said, in 2017, there's many, many ways, and there's an optimum proposal for the census that is refused by the Trump administration. And that would have been a combination of race and ethnicity, write-in boxes, and also choices. What's left over for the 2020 census is that there is some choice in terms of writing in how you would self-identify.
Just want to make a clarification. MENA is Middle Eastern North Africa.
Yes.
Just to make sure everyone understands what that definition is. Okay. The next question. Victoria, I think this one's for you. What is the Attica problem? If you can describe it.
Tina was getting there with hers. So 1971 and the mass uprising because of the human rights abuses in upstate New York in the prison called Attica. And it was the first time I think that people have put two things together, which is the geography of where prisons are. And from 1970 until today, the US has built 1,200 prisons. 70% of those are in rural areas, and also the majority in the state in white districts. And those, as Tina said, who are being targeted for criminalization and put into those spaces are very, very different in demographic background, predominantly Latinx and African-American people who are being locked up. And the relationship, the stark relationship between those who are incarcerated and those who are prison guards and the community around them was the first time seen on national television in 1971 with the focus by Rockefeller on Attica. And ever since then, we've now started to think not only about redistricting and the fact that people are not counted within the communities that they come from, right? Just think about the violence of that. People are, one, not in their communities, but their residence is considered to be a prison. That's not their home. And the relationship then to the power that that imbues in the communities that they don't have a relationship to. That's the Attica problem.
Another question is, would it help to add a mestizo designation to the Latinx Latino category, or a category of brown as well as black and white?
Yes, maybe. That's the answer. Yes, maybe. Yes, but maybe. In the 1960s and 1970s, when advocacy groups pressed the Johnson administration and the Bureau there, they desperately, one of the arguments was, okay, you're using these color categories, let us have a brown category. There were many different problems with this. From a demographer perspective, this was a nightmare. If you think of just sort of the way people think about brown, they thought, well, would this entail also Filipinos? Would this entail also South Asians? Would this entail a wide variety of people? that would then opt in for this category, and then, Latinx populations would not get a true category, right? And so that was nixed. And so, wide variety of other politics happening, and they landed on a sort of Hispanic / Spanish origin, and then sort of Hispanic / Latino label that we have now. Mestizo category is really interesting. My hunch is that would be incredibly problematic as well. But what I like about the question is that it's sort of thinking about what is a different option that we might have. The reason a mestizo category is also difficult is because the census not only needs to provide this way of differentiating folks, it also needs folks to identify with those labels as well. So I would imagine that a mestizo category might be really good at capturing Mexicans, maybe some Central Americans, but might be really bad at capturing Puerto Ricans, capturing, for example, Colombians, capturing some South Americans. And so what you have is this really difficult problem of what is the best label, what is the best category to capture the vision of what the group is, right? I think one of the biggest benefits that we have is now that folks are able to sort of check more than one category, identities like Afro-Latino can be provided if you check Black and if you check Latino, for example. But this is sort of a continuously sort of politically contested, even within the Latinx population, what label you will use, whether you will even say Latinx, right? Or whether you will say Hispanic, are all politically fraught and part of, what is, part and parcel of just a really dynamic and ever-changing group coming to terms with how it will be identified in the context of racial inequality.
Can I just mention one more thing? Sure. I think it's interesting in that context to think that only 4.9% of those who fill in the census do identify as more than one racial category. So, I mean, what is behind that? Given that that's maybe not actually, 97% of African Americans could absolutely identify within more than one racial category. So what is the underlying social structure under which the idea of not identifying with more than one is so seductive? What is the seduction?
And that kind of leads into our next question is, what are we seeing a trend in more people choosing more than one race since 2000? I think that stems from I think what Tina was talking about when she was working with the woman as a enumerator.
Victoria, were you going to jump in? It seemed like you had the...
No,
okay.
No.
I actually don't know the increase, the percentage increase. I know that generally, I think demographically, there are more people who identify as mixed race. I know that it is different when, the whole idea of being Black and mixed race is different than being mixed race with other groups, right? Because of the history of chattel slavery in the United States and the rule of hypodescent, which is what I mentioned in my talk. But I do think in general, there is an uptick in people who identify as mixed race.
Yeah. And to just back onto that also, that one of the most important increases has been in Native American, Indian, Indigenous people, the identification with those categories. So again, what is the question when you're able to identify with more than one? Why are maybe many white people now identifying with Native American populations? What again is the social relationship that people are finding that they want that identification now?
Mm-hmm.
And what happens to the meaning of that category when that happens, right? When you have so many white people or people presenting as white or things of the sort opting in, can you then really actually discern the patterns that are affecting folks on reservations, things of the sort? And so these are all the difficulties involved.
Right. And it's a political category, even though we think of it as a racial category.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Next question is, what legal justifications are being used to argue that the census should end early?
Isn't it the reporting for the president by the end of the year? Christina, Tina?
I don't know. I do know that they want to end it on October 5th. And I do know that on September 17th, that was overturned by the lower courts, and I forget where, and that they decided with the lower courts that this should be October 31st. I think as of today, the census has Wilbur Ross has sent out a communication that it should be October 5th, and they're moving towards that. And I think today the judge in the lower court ruling suggested, I think that's the reporting, suggested that this violates her order. And we'll see. October 31st was set as a deadline by folks in the Census Bureau in their presentation to Wilbur Ross, stating that because of the incredible delays associated with the pandemic, that extending it to October 31st will allow for a fuller count of rural populations, immigrant communities, and other groups that are hard to count. But I think rural populations is at the top of their list.
Yeah, and people on reservations in particular who've been able to reservations have been trying to protect their populations.
I think this might be our last question. Can you say a bit about, can you talk a little bit about counting people who are homeless and some of the issues that come into the census with this?
I mean, I think homeless populations are incredibly difficult to count and always have been. And so they are a group that are just historically undercounted, and again, having to do with like geography and place, tend to be in cities and in suburbs more now, actually. But beyond that, I don't have that much more to say. I know that there are many. At least when I was actually an enumerator, we had a whole team that went out and were, doing a lot of particular work on trying to enumerate the homeless population. In 2020, I have no idea what they're doing, since they have sort of tried to take the legs out from under the whole process in many ways.
Yeah, one thing to keep in mind is that the homeless are not equally distributed. They're mainly found in warmer climates or urban areas. So places like Los Angeles, San Francisco, the West Coast, Florida, even Louisiana, these places. And these places are also tend to be largely sort of states with large minority populations. And so if you are systematic, it'd be different if you'd be systematically missing the homeless because they have no address and they can't receive a ballot. And yet, that meant 5% of South Dakota, 5% of Tennessee, all of that. But when they are mainly concentrated, or when we see them mainly in states like California, that becomes a real problem for California, because California would now be missing some of the much needed resources to actually then address the homeless issue. And so I think this is when you saw, for example, when the Trump administration cut funding or did not fund the census at the level that experts had argued would be sufficient or adequate enough funding. This is when you saw states. I mean, California right now has put in more money into 2020 census than it has ever put before. You see similar patterns in New York, Illinois, things of the sort, in part because this is a highly unequal game. Yeah.
And also between every census, California normally gains 2 seats. So our accurate count is really important for our political representation.
And with that, I want to say thank you to our presenters, Professor Christina Mora, Professor Tina Sachs, and Professor Victoria Robinson for this awesome presentation. I hope everyone learned a lot about the census and how race and ethnicity plays into it. And it is about 1 o'clock, so we can end the session. I want to thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.